When you think of ancient Egypt, you probably picture pharaohs, pyramids, and golden tombs. But behind every monument, every temple, and every royal project were thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. So what did regular ancient Egyptians actually do for work? The answer is more varied than you might expect. And here's the thing. Most of these jobs were inherited. If your father was a farmer, you became a farmer. If your father was a scribe, you went to scribe school. Your occupation was basically decided the day you were born. Ancient Egyptian society was structured like a pyramid, literally and figuratively. At the very top was the pharaoh, considered a god-king with absolute power. Below him came government officials, nobles, and priests. Then came scribes and soldiers. And at the bottom, making up the vast majority of the population, were farmers, laborers, and slaves. Most ordinary Egyptians lived in the lower tiers of this pyramid. They were peasants, artisans, and unskilled workers who sustained the entire economy through their labor. Without them, the civilization would have collapsed. But ordinary doesn't mean simple. The jobs these people did were specialized, demanding, and essential to keeping Egypt running for over 3,000 years. Let's start with the most common job in ancient Egypt: farmer. Approximately 80 to 90% of the population worked in agriculture. The entire Egyptian economy was built on farming, and the Nile River made it possible. A farmer's day began before sunrise. He would wake up, eat a quick breakfast of coarse bread, onions, and beer, then head to the fields. Depending on the season, he'd be planting wheat, barley, flax, chickpeas, lentils, or sesame. Or he'd be harvesting crops before the midday heat became unbearable. Farming in ancient Egypt wasn't just about growing food. Farmers also raised livestock: cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They managed irrigation canals to flood their fields during the annual Nile inundation, and they paid taxes to the state in the form of grain, which was stored in massive granaries and used to pay government workers. Most farmers were peasants, free people who worked the land, not slaves. But they were bound to their master's estate and couldn't easily change occupations. Their lives were hard, repetitive, and entirely dependent on the Nile's flooding cycle. If the flood was too low, crops failed. If it was too high, fields were destroyed. If you were born a peasant, there was really only one way to move up the social ladder: become a scribe. Scribes were educated individuals who could read and write hieroglyphs and hieratic script. They were essential to the administration of Egypt, recording taxes, managing accounts, writing legal documents, and keeping track of harvests. Becoming a scribe required years of training. Boys started scribe school around age 5 and studied until they were 17. School began at sunrise and ended at sunset. The curriculum included writing, reading, mathematics, geometry, geography, law, religion, and even music and architecture. It was brutal. Students were expected to memorize hundreds of hieroglyphic symbols and practice writing on papyrus or limestone flakes. Discipline was harsh. Texts mention that students were beaten if they didn't perform well. But if you passed your exams, the rewards were significant. Scribes could work for the government, write books, compose letters for noblemen, or even write coffin texts for grave sites. They were exempt from manual labor, paid in grain and beer, and occupied a respected middle-class position in society. For an ordinary Egyptian, becoming a scribe was the closest thing to a meritocracy that existed. Not all ordinary Egyptians were farmers or scribes. A significant portion of the population worked as artisans and craftsmen, skilled workers who created the objects that defined Egyptian culture. These included stonemasons who carved the massive blocks used in temples and pyramids, carpenters who built furniture, coffins, and boats, potters who made clay vessels for storage and daily use, weavers who produced linen textiles from flax, metalworkers who crafted tools, weapons, and jewelry from copper, jewelers who created intricate ornaments for the elite, painters and sculptors who decorated tombs and temples, glassblowers who made beads and small vessels, leatherworkers who produced sandals, bags, and armor, basket makers who wove containers from reeds and palm fibers. These artisans occupied the middle tier of Egyptian society, above peasants but below scribes and priests. Their work was highly valued, and the most skilled craftsmen could achieve significant status. The best evidence for artisan life comes from Deir el-Medina, a workers' village on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. This village housed the craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period. Life in Deir el-Medina was surprisingly modern. Workers lived in multi-room stone houses with their families. They received regular rations of grain, fish, beer, and firewood from the state. They worked an 8-day cycle with 2 days off, a schedule that could be extended due to illness, family matters, or even arguing with one's wife or having a hangover, according to village records. The men would leave the village for 8 to 10 days at a time, sleeping in temporary huts near the Valley of the Kings while they worked on tombs. Then they'd return home for their 2 days off. During their absence, the village was occupied primarily by women and children. These artisans were not slaves, they were paid employees of the state, and they took their work seriously. In fact, Deir el-Medina is where history's first recorded labor strike took place, when workers protested delayed grain deliveries. Not everyone was a skilled artisan. Many ordinary Egyptians worked as unskilled laborers on state projects, building pyramids, temples, canals, roads, and other infrastructure. These workers were often conscripted peasants, required to provide labor as a form of tax. During the Old Kingdom, when the Great Pyramids were built, thousands of laborers were mobilized each year to work on royal construction projects. Contrary to popular belief, pyramid builders were not slaves. They were paid workers who received rations of bread, beer, grain, onions, and occasionally meat. Their work was recorded by scribes, and they lived in organized workers' villages with housing, food, and medical care. Still, the work was brutal. Quarrying stone, dragging massive blocks, and building monuments under the desert sun was exhausting and dangerous. Many workers died from injuries, heat exhaustion, or disease. Military service was another common occupation for ordinary Egyptians. During the New Kingdom, when Egypt was at the height of its power, the army was massive and professional. Soldiers served multiple roles. They defended Egypt's borders from foreign invaders, participated in military campaigns to expand the empire, and worked on construction projects during peacetime. They were paid in grain, land, and sometimes spoils from military campaigns. For some ordinary Egyptians, military service offered a path to advancement. Successful soldiers could be rewarded with land, promotions, or positions in the royal administration. Ancient Egypt didn't use coins for most of its history. Instead, the economy ran on a barter system. Goods were traded based on their value in a unit called the deben, a weight measurement roughly equivalent to 90 grams of copper. Merchants facilitated this trade. They bought and sold goods in local markets, transported products along the Nile, and engaged in long-distance trade with neighboring regions like Nubia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Common trade goods included grain, linen, papyrus, jewelry, tools, pottery, and luxury items like incense, ivory, and exotic woods. Merchants traveled by boat along the Nile or by donkey caravan across the desert. Merchants occupied a middle-class position in society, above peasants but below scribes and priests. Successful merchants could accumulate significant wealth, though they were still considered part of the commoner class. Women in ancient Egypt had more rights than women in most ancient civilizations. They could own property, run businesses, initiate divorce, and work in trades alongside men. Common jobs for women included bakers who made bread in large quantities, brewers who produced beer, the national drink, weavers who spun and wove linen, perfume makers who created cosmetics and fragrances, midwives who assisted with childbirth, priestesses who served in temples, dancers and musicians who performed at festivals and banquets, mourners who were paid to cry at funerals. Most women, however, worked in the home, caring for children, preparing food, and managing household affairs. In farming families, women also worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons. In Deir el-Medina, women ran the village while their husbands were away working on tombs. Some women even ran their own businesses from home, trading goods or providing services to the community. Beyond these, Egyptian towns were full of other specialized jobs. Barbers who cut hair and shaved heads, doctors who treated illnesses and injuries, butchers who slaughtered animals and sold meat, water carriers who transported water from the Nile, fishermen who caught fish from the Nile, boat builders who constructed vessels for transport. Egypt had a highly specialized economy with workers for almost every conceivable task. This specialization was possible because the agricultural surplus from farming allowed some people to pursue non-farming occupations. Since ancient Egypt didn't use coins, workers were paid in goods, primarily grain, bread, and beer. These rations were standardized and distributed from state granaries and storehouses. A typical worker might receive monthly rations of grain, bread, beer, fish, vegetables, and occasionally meat. Scribes and officials received larger rations, while laborers received smaller amounts. Workers could also use grain banks, state warehouses where they deposited grain and withdrew it when needed. The fees collected from these transactions were used to pay state workers. For larger purchases, Egyptians used metal weights or bartered directly with neighbors in marketplaces. So what jobs did ordinary ancient Egyptians have? Almost everything you can imagine, except the ones that required modern technology. Farmers grew the food that fed the civilization. Scribes kept the administration running. Artisans created the objects that defined Egyptian culture. Laborers built the monuments that still stand today. Soldiers defended the empire. Merchants traded goods along the Nile and beyond. And women worked both inside and outside the home, contributing to the economy in countless ways. Most of these jobs were inherited, hard and repetitive, but they were also essential. Without the ordinary workers of ancient Egypt, the farmers, the scribes, the artisans, the laborers, there would have been no pyramids, no temples, no pharaohs, just an empty desert. And that's the real story of ancient Egypt.